the scramble commence.
Slaves would be inspected by prospective buyers who would poke and prod and open their mouths and all these things to try to assess the physical capacity of the slave.
From medical experiments to fancy slave trade that commodified children for sexual exploitation, to public humiliation and degradation, to forced breeding that treated women as livestock, each of these horrors was what slave owners inflicted on their slaves, creating an experience that survivors themselves described as worse than death: the fancy trade. Let me take you to the slave markets of 19th century New Orleans and Alexandria, Virginia, where a particularly sinister practice flourished in the shadows of legitimate slave trading. This was called the fancy trade, which specialized in the sale of light-skinned or mixed-race enslaved girls and women, often advertised as fancy girls or maids to signify their youth and virginity-like appeal. Picture this horrifying scene. Young girls, typically between just 12 and 18 years old, paraded before crowds of wealthy white men like prized livestock. But unlike slaves sold for field labor or domestic work, these children were explicitly marketed for one purpose: sexual exploitation, and the prices reflected this depravity. These young females fetched prices 2 to 3 times higher than average slaves, up to $1,800, which would be equivalent to $50,000 to $60,000 in today's money. Traders like Rice C. Ballard and Isaac Franklin turned this into a grotesque business model. They would dress these terrified children in fine clothing, garments the girls would never own, never choose for themselves. They housed them separately from other enslaved people, creating a twisted illusion of privilege while actually isolating them from any potential support or protection. Then they would parade them before potential buyers, playing to white men's fantasies of dominance and exoticism, turning human beings into objects of desire and consumption. The legal foundation for this horror had been laid centuries earlier. Virginia's 1662 statute tied a child's enslaved status to the mother, which encouraged interracial exploitation, while conveniently shielding white fathers from any responsibility. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate policy choice that gave white men legal permission to rape enslaved women without any consequences whatsoever. Their children would simply be more property, more profit, perpetuating the cycle endlessly. Consider the story of Louisa Piquet, a name that should be remembered alongside any discussion of American slavery's horrors. She was sold at just 14 years old for $1,500 and endured years of systematic abuse before finally gaining freedom only upon her owner's death. Imagine being 14, still a child by any measure, torn from everything familiar, purchased specifically for sexual exploitation, and knowing that your only hope for freedom was for your abuser to die. She bore children during these years of captivity, children who served as constant, living reminders of the violation she endured daily. Then there were Avinia White and Susan Johnson, purchased by Rice C. Ballard in 1832, who bore his children before he freed them in 1838, and they moved to Cincinnati. Cincinnati became a hub for formerly enslaved mixed-race families, a community bound together by shared trauma and survival. But freedom didn't erase the years of abuse, didn't heal the psychological wounds, didn't bring back the childhood these women never got to have. The fancy trade wasn't just about individual suffering. It was a calculated assault on entire Black communities. It emasculated enslaved men who were forced to watch, helpless, as their daughters, sisters, and wives were sold into sexual slavery. It sent a clear message about power, about who was considered human and who was considered property, about whose bodies mattered and whose could be violated with impunity. This was racial terrorism dressed up in economic language, and it was entirely legal. Systematic sexual violence. The sexual violence inflicted upon young enslaved girls wasn't sporadic or occasional. It was endemic, systematic, and utterly pervasive throughout the institution of slavery. Historical analyses suggest that 58% of enslaved women aged 15 to 30 experienced sexual assault. Think about that staggering statistic for a moment. More than half of all young enslaved women were sexually violated. And these weren't just statistics. These were human beings, each with hopes and dreams and the fundamental right to bodily autonomy, all of which were stripped away. But here's what makes this even more insidious. The system didn't just permit this violence, it actively justified it through racist ideology. Owners rationalized their assaults through the Jezebel stereotype, which portrayed Black women as inherently promiscuous, effectively negating the very concept of consent and shifting blame onto the victims themselves. This wasn't just criminal criminal behavior. It was criminal behavior given ideological cover, wrapped in pseudoscientific racism that painted the victims as somehow deserving of their abuse. Young girls identified or marketed as virgins faced particular vulnerability. They were targeted from the onset of puberty by not just their owners, but also by overseers, the owner's relatives, visitors, and sometimes even students at nearby universities. In one particularly disturbing case from 1826 at the University of Virginia, 2 white students raped a 16-year-old enslaved girl and then beat her afterward. These weren't uneducated men from the frontier. These were supposedly civilized, educated young men from privileged families, demonstrating how deeply the dehumanization of Black people had infected every level of society. The legal system didn't just fail to punish these crimes, it didn't even recognize them as crimes in the first place. Rape of enslaved women was not criminalized, and in cases like Mississippi's 1859 George v. State decision, assaults on girls under age 10 were dismissed because they were considered property, not people. Let that sink in. A 10-year-old child could be raped, and the court said it didn't matter because she was property. The law treated these children with less consideration than it gave to livestock. The methods of coercion were varied and horrific. Threats of being sold away from family, bribes that were meaningless since enslaved people owned nothing, whippings that left permanent scars, deliberate starvation used as punishment for resistance. Girls as young as 12 were expected to bear children for their enslavers, their bodies violated and then exploited for reproduction before they'd even finished growing themselves. Perhaps no testimony captures this horror more powerfully than that of Harriet Jacobs, whose autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, published in 1861, remains one of the most important first-hand accounts of slavery. Jacobs detailed how her master began pursuing her sexually from age 15, telling her, "He told me I was his property, that I must be subject to his will in all things." To escape this relentless harassment, Jacobs made an almost unimaginable choice. She hid in a tiny attic crawl space for 7 years. 7 years of her life spent in a space so small she couldn't stand up, in conditions that damaged her body permanently, suffering from heat, cold, rats, and darkness. She described this cramped hiding place as a living grave, but she considered it preferable to submitting to her master's sexual demands. Think about what that means. That being buried alive, metaphorically speaking, seemed better than the alternative. That's how terrible the alternative was. Other women's resistance led to even more tragic outcomes. There was Celia, enslaved at age 14 in Missouri, who endured repeated rapes until 1855 when she finally fought back and killed her owner. The state's response? They hanged her for it. A child who defended herself from serial rape was executed by the state. Then there was Nellie, another 14-year-old girl who faced infanticide charges amid suspected postpartum trauma from assault. These violations didn't just destroy the moment they occurred, they shattered entire lives. Young girls had their innocence stolen before they even understood what was being taken from them. They lived in perpetual terror, never knowing when the next assault would come. And if they became pregnant from these rapes, which happened constantly, they were forced to raise children who served as living, breathing reminders of their trauma. Every day, looking at those children, remembering. This is why survivors described it as worse than death. Death would have been final, but this torture continued every single day with no end in sight. Forced breeding. Wombs as property. After the United States banned the international slave trade in 1807, enslavers faced a problem: how to maintain and expand their enslaved labor force without importing people from Africa. Their solution was as calculated as it was cruel. They would force young enslaved women to breed new generations of slaves, treating these women's bodies as production facilities for human property. Let me be very clear about what this meant. Young women, often girls barely into their teens, were deliberately paired with men chosen by their enslavers for the explicit purpose of producing children. Owners forced these young women into breeding to replenish their labor supply, treating them like livestock. This wasn't romance. It wasn't courtship. It wasn't even prostitution. It was industrial-scale forced reproduction. The mindset behind this practice was openly stated by those who benefited from it. In 1832, Virginia delegate James H. Golson publicly likened enslaved women to broodmares, stating that owners bore gestation costs for profitable increase. He said this in the state legislature, as official government business, without shame or hesitation. To these men, enslaved women weren't people with feelings, hopes, or bodily autonomy. They were breeding stock, and the children born from forced reproduction were simply a return on investment. The mechanics of this forced breeding were brutal and degrading. Narratives describe pairings that took place in barns or lodges, with resistance met by severe whippings. Imagine being told you must have sexual relations with a person you might not know, might not want, might actively fear. and knowing that refusal means being tied to a post and beaten until you comply or until your spirit breaks entirely. Rose Williams, who was enslaved in Texas, left behind testimony about her own experience with forced breeding. She recounted being forced to partner with a man named Rufus, with her enslaver telling her, "If you doesn't want whipping it to steak, just do what I wants." The choice was no choice at all. Submit to rape or be tortured. And this wasn't presented as punishment for some crime. This was simply the exercise of property rights over her body. Some women endured this horror repeatedly across decades. There was a woman known as Long Peggy, who gave birth to 25 children and was finally freed only after her reproductive utility had ended. 25 children, each pregnancy risking her life, each birth tearing her body, each child likely sold away eventually, each one a piece of her heart walked away in shackles. She spent her entire reproductive life as a human breeding machine, valued only for her ability to produce more property for her enslaver. And the abuse didn't stop during pregnancy. If anything, it intensified in its calculated cruelty. Pregnant women were flogged in special positions designed to protect the fetus while still inflicting maximum pain on the mother, with salt rubbed into the wounds to amplify the agony. Think about the psychology of this. They hurt her enough to break her spirit, but not enough to damage the valuable product she was carrying. The fetus had more legal protection than the woman carrying it because the fetus represented future profit. This added another layer of psychological torment. Every time a pregnant woman was whipped, she had to live with the guilt and fear of potentially harming her unborn child through no fault of her own. The enslavers weaponized the natural maternal instinct to protect one's child, turning it into another tool of control and another source of suffering. The assault on these women's bodies even extended into the realm of medical experimentation. Enslaved women were subjected to gynecological experiments, often without any anesthesia whatsoever, procedures that sometimes led to death or permanent disability. The enslaver physician J. Marion Sims, often celebrated as the father of modern gynecology, developed his surgical techniques by experimenting on enslaved women who had no ability to consent and received no pain relief. Their bodies were treated as disposable test subjects, their pain dismissed as irrelevant, all in service of advancing medical knowledge that would primarily benefit white women who did receive anesthesia. Forced breeding didn't just violate these women's bodies, it eroded their very sense of self. It turned the natural process of motherhood into a curse, a source of perpetual bondage rather than joy. Every child born from forced breeding represented another chain binding them to slavery, because enslavers knew that mothers were less likely to attempt escape if it meant leaving their children behind. The children themselves were born into bondage, denied the chance to ever know freedom unless something miraculous happened. Public humiliation and degradation. Beyond the private horrors of sexual violence and forced breeding, young enslaved girls endured public degradation designed to strip away every shred of dignity and humanity. These public humiliations served multiple purposes. They reinforced the enslaver's power, they terrorized other enslaved people into submission, and they normalized the dehumanization of black people in the eyes of white society. At the very heart of this public degradation was the slave auction itself. Girls were subjected to forced public nudity during auctions, intimate physical examinations, and invasive inspections of their bodies. Picture being a teenage girl, already terrified and traumatized, forced to stand naked on an auction block while strange men examined your teeth like you were a horse, poked and prodded your body, discussed your physical attributes as if you couldn't hear them, as if you weren't even human enough to deserve basic modesty. Buyers didn't just look, they touched. They would inspect enslaved women's bodies intimately, checking for signs of disease, assessing their reproductive potential, evaluating them as breeding stock. For young girls identified as virgins, this inspection was particularly invasive and humiliating. These examinations weren't medical. They were purchasing evaluations, treating human beings like livestock being considered for purchase. Even daily life involved systematic humiliation through enforced inadequate clothing. François-Jean de Chastellux, a visitor to the American South, noted how inadequate clothing deliberately exposed enslaved women, heightening their vulnerability and stripping them of dignity. This wasn't poverty or oversight. It was a calculated choice. Enslavers could afford to clothe enslaved people adequately if they wanted to, but inadequate clothing served as a constant reminder of powerlessness and exposure. Whippings and other corporal punishments were often conducted publicly, turning physical torture into community spectacle. Public strippings and beatings inflicted profound shame that could outlast the physical wounds. For young women and girls, being stripped and beaten in front of others, including men, including children, including their own family members who were forced to watch, compounded the trauma exponentially. Some punishments were specifically designed to maximize humiliation. women could be forced to wear degrading signs announcing their supposed crimes. They could be locked into devices like stocks or pillories in public places where any passerby could see them, mock them, or even assault them further with complete impunity. The spectacle was the point. These punishments were theatrical performances designed to demoralize the entire enslaved community. For pregnant women, the humiliation intensified. They were flogged in positions meant to protect the fetus, while maximizing the mother's pain and exposure, with salt rubbed into wounds. Imagine being pregnant, vulnerable, your body already changing in ways beyond your control, and then being forced into a degrading position for public punishment. The message was clear: your body isn't yours, your pregnancy isn't yours, even your pain is something to be managed for someone else's benefit. Mutilation and physical torture. When sexual exploitation, forced breeding, and public humiliation weren't sufficient to break the spirits of young enslaved women, enslavers turned to outright physical mutilation and torture. These practices went beyond punishment for specific acts. They were designed to permanently mark the body, to cause lifelong pain, and to serve as warnings to others about the consequences of resistance or even perceived disobedience. Mutilation as punishment could include genital harm, amputations, or other forms of bodily destruction, often performed without any medical care whatsoever. Think about what this means in practical terms. A young woman might have her genitals deliberately damaged as punishment for resisting sexual assault. The very act of trying to protect herself could result in injuries that would cause pain for the rest of her life, potentially rendering her infertile and further destroying her sense of bodily integrity. Amputations were particularly cruel because they were permanent, visible reminders of the enslaver's power. Fingers, toes, ears, body parts could be removed for infractions as minor as attempting to learn to read or trying to visit family on a neighboring plantation without permission. These amputations were typically done without anesthesia, without proper medical care, leaving victims to either heal on their own or die from infection. One particularly horrific account involves Betty Gordon, who was raped at just 6 years old. 6 years old. She wasn't even close to adolescence, was still very much a child in every sense of the word. The sexual assault of someone so young almost certainly caused physical damage beyond the immediate trauma, potentially affecting her ability to have normal bodily functions for the rest of her life. The fact that this was even possible, that someone could commit such an act and face no legal consequences, demonstrates the complete absence of protection for enslaved children. Whippings were the most common form of physical torture, but the implements and methods used elevated them beyond simple beatings into the realm of deliberate, calculated torture. Enslavers didn't just use whips. They used cat-o'-nine tails with multiple leather strands designed to tear flesh, whips embedded with metal pieces or glass shards, paddles with holes that created suction to tear skin more effectively. The practice of rubbing salt, pepper, or turpentine into fresh whip wounds was common, deliberately amplifying the pain and prolonging the agony of healing. Some forms of mutilation were specifically designed to prevent escape or resistance. Heavy iron collars with protruding spikes made it impossible to lie down comfortably or move through wooded areas without severe pain. Chains connecting leg irons created a shuffling gait that prevented running. These devices weren't just restraints, they were instruments of ongoing torture that inflicted pain with every movement, every attempt to rest, every moment of existence. The psychological impact of mutilation extended beyond the physical pain. These injuries often caused permanent disability, rendering women unable to perform certain types of work or, in cases of genital mutilation, potentially unable to bear children. For women whose value was partially assessed based on their reproductive capacity or labor potential, these disabilities could actually provide a grim form of protection from further exploitation, but at a terrible cost to their bodies and their sense of wholeness. The knowledge that any form of resistance could result in permanent mutilation created an atmosphere of constant fear and calculation. Was it worth resisting sexual assault if the consequence might be genital mutilation? Was it worth attempting escape if capture would result in the amputation of toes or feet? These impossible choices between submission and disability, between compliance and permanent harm, represented another dimension of the torture these women endured: family separation and the destruction of bonds. Amid all the physical tortures and sexual violence, perhaps nothing exemplified how enslavers viewed enslaved people as less than human, more than their willingness to tear families apart. For young enslaved girls, the destruction of family bonds represented not just emotional trauma, but the loss of any potential protection, guidance, or comfort from those who loved them. The practice of selling family members away from each other was routine and frequent, with children regularly auctioned away from their mothers, siblings scattered across different plantations, and couples forcibly separated. This wasn't an unfortunate side effect of slavery. It was a deliberate strategy. Enslavers understood that family bonds could provide emotional strength and potential support for resistance. By systematically destroying these connections, they isolated individuals and increased their control. For young girls, separation from their mothers meant losing whatever minimal protection a mother might provide. In the context of pervasive sexual violence, mothers might try to negotiate or offer themselves instead of their daughters. But when girls were sold away, that fragile protection vanished entirely. The trauma of separation was profound and lasting. These separations created perpetual grief and loneliness that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Imagine being torn from your mother's arms, watching her scream and reach for you as you're dragged away, knowing you'll probably never see her again. Some mothers faced an even more horrific choice. In 1856, Margaret Garner killed her children rather than allow them to be returned to slavery. She saw death as mercy compared to the life that awaited them. When we understand the full context of what young enslaved girls endured, the sexual violence, the forced breeding, the torture, Margaret Garner's actions become a testament to just how terrible slavery truly was. When Harriet Jacobs attempted to negotiate for her freedom and that of her children, her enslaver threatened to have her children imprisoned. The children themselves became weapons to control their mother, tools to ensure her compliance and continued subjugation. The destruction of family bonds served multiple purposes for enslavers. It prevented the formation of strong family units that might resist collectively. It eliminated the possibility of fathers protecting daughters or mothers shielding children. It created isolated, vulnerable individuals who had no one to turn to, and it sent a clear message. Relationships, love, family. These fundamental aspects of human existence were privileges that enslaved people were not entitled to. Psychological torture and the erosion of sanity. While the physical tortures and sexual violence inflicted on young enslaved girls were horrific, the psychological warfare waged against them was equally devastating and, in many ways, more insidious. This wasn't just natural psychological damage from trauma. This was deliberate, calculated psychological torture designed to break spirits, control behavior, and ensure complete submission. The psychological tactics employed included constant threats, relentless surveillance, manipulation, and mind games that slowly eroded mental health and peace of mind. Imagine living every single day never knowing when you might be beaten, raped, sold away, or subjected to some new horror. The uncertainty itself becomes torture because you can never relax, never feel safe, never let your guard down. For young girls facing sexual predation, the psychological torture began long before physical assault. Enslavers engaged in grooming behaviors, making suggestive comments, touching inappropriately but not violently, making intentions clear while building anticipation and dread. Harriet Jacobs's enslaver pursued her relentlessly from age 15 onward, creating an environment of constant harassment that affected her every waking moment. The surveillance was omnipresent and suffocating. Enslaved people were watched constantly by enslavers, by overseers, by other enslaved people forced to report on one another. For young women trying to protect themselves from sexual assault, this meant no safe space, no private moment, no place to hide except through extreme measures, like Jacobs's 7 years in an attic crawlspace. That choice itself demonstrates the psychological toll of constant threat. She described yearning for death during her years of hiding, feeling that isolation and physical suffering in that tiny space might be preferable to the sexual abuse she was fleeing. A young woman so desperate to escape harassment that she voluntarily buried herself alive, metaphorically speaking, for 7 years. The darkness, the inability to stand, the rats, the extreme temperatures, the physical deterioration all seemed better than the alternative. Harriet Jacobs captured this when she described the degradation, the wrongs, the vices induced by slavery. Slavery didn't just inflict suffering, it created an environment so toxic that it fundamentally altered how people could think about themselves and their place in the world. For young girls marketed as virgins, whose entire identity in enslavers' eyes was reduced to sexual availability, the psychological impact of this objectification was profound. The threat of sexual violence, combined with objectification inherent in being sold specifically for sexual purposes, created psychological trauma that some described as making survival itself feel cursed. Medical experimentation. Without consent or care among the many horrors that young enslaved women endured, The use of their bodies for medical experimentation represents a particular violation that combined physical torture with the complete absence of medical ethics. This wasn't healthcare. It was exploitation dressed up in the language of medical progress, using black women's bodies as disposable test subjects for procedures that would later benefit white patients. Enslaved women were subjected to gynecological experiments and surgical procedures, often without any anesthesia whatsoever. Let me emphasize this. Invasive surgeries that modern patients would receive general anesthesia for were performed on conscious women who could feel everything. The justification? A racist, pseudoscientific belief that black people didn't feel pain the way white people did. A lie convenient for those who wanted to experiment on living subjects without providing pain relief. The physician J. Marion Sims, often celebrated as the father of modern gynecology, developed his surgical techniques through experiments on enslaved women. These women, including Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy, underwent repeated surgical procedures without anesthesia, with some dying from complications and others having their bodies dissected post-mortem to advance medical knowledge. The procedures Sims developed treated vesicovaginal fistulas, a complication of childbirth particularly common among enslaved women due to brutal forced breeding conditions and inadequate medical care during pregnancy. So in a terrible irony, enslaved women suffered complications from forced reproduction, and then their suffering from those complications was exploited to develop treatments that would primarily benefit white women, who would, unlike the black women whose torture made these treatments possible, receive anesthesia. Ovarian surgeries and other gynecological procedures performed on enslaved women sometimes led to death. And when women died, their bodies were often dissected post-mortem without any consent or respect for the deceased. Even in death, their bodies were not their own. Medical students practiced surgical techniques on enslaved corpses, treating these bodies as teaching tools rather than human remains deserving dignity and respect. What makes this particularly insidious is how it was justified. Medical professionals convinced themselves they were advancing human knowledge, making important discoveries, contributing to the greater good. Burning and fire, torture as ultimate terror. While most forms of torture inflicted on enslaved people were designed to extract labor, ensure compliance, or serve enslavers' sexual desires, one particular form was reserved for those accused of the most serious acts of resistance: burning. This was punishment designed not just to kill, but to terrorize entire communities, to create spectacles of suffering so horrific that the memory alone would prevent others from considering resistance. The use of fire as punishment included various forms: burning at the stake, immolation, scalding with hot liquids, branding with hot irons, and burning of specific body parts like toes. Each method created specific agony, but all shared the quality of being among the most painful ways a human being can suffer. Historical records document multiple instances of enslaved people being burned alive for alleged crimes. In the New York conspiracy of 1741, 13 black men were burned at the stake following accusations of arson and rebellion conspiracy. In South Carolina, a man named Dan was burned alive for killing a white man while allegedly defending a woman. The account describes how witnesses, forced to watch, fainted from the horror of the spectacle. In Mississippi in 1842, 2 enslaved people were burned at the stake following accusations of murder and rape, with newspapers like The Liberator reporting on the event. The public nature of these executions was deliberate. They were designed to be witnessed by as many people as possible, particularly by the enslaved community. While most documented burnings involved men, young women were not immune from fire-related torture. Harriet Jacobs was scalded with hot fat as punishment, possibly in retaliation for helping family members with escape attempts. Burns from hot fat or oil are particularly severe because the liquid adheres to skin, continuing to burn even after initial contact. In Grenada, Mississippi, a man named Paul was burned with hot paddles after whipping failed to break it. He had been helping enslaved people escape via underground railroads. In Hinds County, Mississippi, around 1835, a runaway named Henry had his toes burned off. These localized burnings were meant to inflict maximum pain while keeping victims alive and, theoretically, able to continue working, though the permanent disabilities they created often made that impossible. For young women specifically designated as virgins or sold in the fancy trade, while we don't have many direct accounts of them being burned at the stake, they were subject to threats of burning and related tortures. The knowledge that such punishments existed, that other enslaved people had been burned alive, created an atmosphere of absolute terror. The threat alone was often enough to ensure compliance. Click on one of the cards on your screen to see more videos like this.